General Kellogg, welcome to Constitutional Chats.
Look, thanks for having me. I really appreciate it. It's good to be with you all. This is a really interesting topic you're talking about with not only just the Constitution, but the Constitution overseas and the military as well. Look, a little bit of a quick background. Obviously, I spent time in the military, and I took an oath to the Constitution, not to a person, but to a document. And then when I went into the White House, it was interesting because I became what was called a commissioned officer, an assistant to the president. And the assistants to the president inside the White House, they are the senior advisors to the president. You also take an oath. It's just like the oath you take to the military. It's to the Constitution of the United States of America. And I think that's kind of gives you your baseline of where you're coming from. And all of us need to remember that, except for the Constitution of San Marco, and I really don't, that's a little self-enclosed country of 37,000. We have the oldest constitution, working constitution in the world. But I also remember what Benjamin Franklin was asked when he left the Constitutional Convention, when he was asked, "What did you give us?" And he said to the nation at the time, "I gave you a republic if you can keep it." And that's something we should keep in mind the whole time, and the value we have with the Constitution, and what the Constitution implies for all of us and what we intend to do. And when you're in the White House and you're in the military, you don't wake up every morning going, "I support the Constitution. I think about the Constitution." It's ingrained in you. But as my experience has been over the years in studying it, and I would tell people that are listening right now, that's one thing you should really do. If you really do want to understand the Constitution, study it hard. Go back and read the Federalist Papers, the 60+ papers that were written to support the confirmation of the Constitution, and think about how this Constitution has grown in the sense of all the additions to it after you go into the basic document of the Bill of Rights. It's really a magnificent document. I will tell you, you sit back and you think, how did the founding fathers come up with this document that lived for so long? And where did they come up with the beautiful wisdom that they had? And when I look at it from the national security aspect, and especially from the military aspect, when you look at separation of powers, they really broke it apart beautifully when you think about it, because Article 1, Section 8 of the Constitution really talks about the role of Congress in the military. Basically, they have the ability to not only raise a military, but also they're the ones who can, declare war. And then you transfer that to Article 2, Section 2, which gives the president his role as commander in chief and the role that he plays there. So there's a duality there that I think is absolutely fascinating to work when you actually work it. And over the years, it's really withstood the test of time. And when you see what's happening in the world today, and I think it's very, very important people look at that in the national security realm, what the Constitution brings, what you should be doing with the Constitution, what you should be thinking about. But it's almost ingrained in what you do, because there's a lot of, even today, things being thrown around politically on both parties and across the entire spectrum about the role of the Constitution, what's going to happen. There's a lot of loose language being thrown. I think if you stay steady and you look at the document and you can really follow it pretty clearly and understand where you're coming from, where we're coming from with the Constitution, it makes a lot of sense to me. When you look what's happening with Israel today, I know there's some talk about, well, what's happening with Israel. There's an issue is, are we doing things that are constitutionally correct with them? Yes, we are. People need to I remind people with Israel, the first nation that recognized Israel as a nation state was the United States. And we did it with Truman when he was president. And it took us all of 11 minutes to say we recognize Israel. And the things that you see happening in the Middle East today with potential use of force and the concerns that we have out there and expanding this war that is actually occurring there, and the role that the Congress plays and the role that the president plays as well. It's an interesting duality. And of course, you've got the courts in there being the arbiter, what's going to happen between both of them. But look, I'm actually interested in listening and talking to you and responding to your questions. And if we could, let's go to you talking to everybody about it and what's happening.
Well, thank you so much, General. And I love that you brought up Benjamin Franklin's quotes. It's one of our favorite quotes. And I believe tomorrow actually happens to be his I think, his 318th birthday. So that was very timely as well. Janine, we'd love to go to you first.
Sure. That was a wonderful opening, General Kellogg. Thank you so much for that. Um, it's just it is brilliant. I agree. I concur that the checks and balances that we have in our Constitution, but also the fact that everyone swears to withhold and uphold and protect, the Constitution, not people, not but the Constitution, because the Constitution protects us. And so many people don't know that, or that when people are sworn into office or sworn into the armed forces, that they swear to protect the Constitution. And it's we talk about that when we speak in the schools, and students are we say, when people who work for the government are sworn in, what do they swear to protect the people, or do they swear to protect the Constitution? And so many students say the people, because it's a bit confusing, but then we explain that the Constitution actually protects us. Anywho, so let's talk about Israel a little bit, since that's the focus of our day. I think, would you flesh out for us? And we haven't heard this much on the news, and I believe it's relatively important. The difference between the government that Israel has and the Sharia law. I'm assuming that the Palestinians are under Sharia law. Is that true? And the freedoms that Israel and the democracy in the region, as a democracy with Israel, we know what that's all about. But what sort of government, what kind of freedoms do they have under their laws in with the surrounding countries that are not democracies?
Yeah, it's really a fascinating region to study and to look at. When we started working with the last administration with the Palestinians, uh, we actually developed a plan called the Abraham Accords, because when you look at the three major religions of the world, everybody looks at Abraham as the founder of the religion. Uh, and it's actually fascinating when you get into it. And then when you look at it's either when you talk about the Sunni and the Shiite split, which is a religious split, and it sounds simplistic, but because most people probably understand this. It's sort of like Protestant and Catholic. And what I mean by that, you have two different, they believe in, a higher being, but they also have their different ways of looking at it. But they all fall under Sharia law. And Sharia law is a pretty harsh law. Some follow it much more stringently, like the Iranians, and the Saudi Arabians as well. Then others that are that are there, maybe you go into Kosovo or places that are also Muslim that don't follow it as closely. And then you look at it, you got your Jewish state, Israel, which is right across the border. And the schism that you find there it's biblical in nature. And Janine, I will tell you, listening to what's happening there, this when I listen to Bibi Netanyahu, who's the prime minister of Israel, it's fascinating to hear I'd remind people, listen very closely to what he says, because this fight that Israel is now fighting against Hamas, he has put that in biblical terms. And the reason why that's important is because they're falling back on religion and on the Bible to do it. And in fact, when he started talking about what happened with Hamas, he came out, and when in his first speech, he said, there's a time for peace and there's a time for war, and now is the time for war. That's right out of Ecclesiastes 3:8. It's amazing. He said he pulled it right out of the Bible, and he has on other occasions as well. So it's a real hard religious split, but also the Palestinians as a group of people are really the lost tribe. The Egyptians don't want them. The Jordanians don't want them. They're stuck there in Gaza. They're stuck there in the West Bank, and there can be accommodations long term. The trouble is it's gone past that, and hardcore terrorist organizations, Hamas, has taken over, and they've kind of put this whole thing in motion with the Israelis. There was an opportunity, I believe, a huge lost opportunity uh, for them to kind of come back around and look at the economics and make Gaza economically prosperous. When you think about it, they've got, quote, beachfront property. Gaza itself if you can exploit the ability they have there economically, it could be a garden spot because it's right on the Mediterranean. You can make it a beautiful, a beautiful area for people to visit. And if you look at pictures of Gaza 30, 40 years ago, that's what it was like. So there's this huge religious schism. It happens all through the world. You see the same thing that we saw with they called it the Troubles, when you had the issues between the Northern Irish and the Protestants and the Catholics there in Northern Ireland. I've found religious disputes in Africa as well. You just have to kind of set the table a little bit and support. And I hate to put it this way because it may come across weird. You support the peace efforts as best you can to try to stop the killing out there, because it's actually, especially in the Middle East, it's brutal. And that's the reason I made that comment about biblical issues. That's where they're heading to. This thing is not going to stop near term. And in our positions as the United States, but we've always been a very, very strong backer of Israel. We're going to continue to stay involved with this because actually in our best interest out there. But somebody's going to get involved, Janine, and figure a way to calm the waters. And there's no interlocutor now available to do it. We thought originally the Saudis could do it. They've kind of backed away. The Jordanians won't do it at all, and the Egyptians won't do it either. So this thing is going to continue, unfortunately.
Such wisdom, but I have to toss because we all just get a certain amount of time. But before I do, but can we compare our Constitution, and our freedom of religion, freedom of speech, all the freedoms that we have and that women have and that we have in every genre? Can we compare our Constitution and all that it upholds with Sharia law? I mean, in the Palestinian states and in a lot of these other surrounding countries, their constitution is Sharia law, isn't it? And Sharia law is very, very severe. Can you talk about Sharia law a little bit? Because I think that people don't understand the kind of stern quality of Sharia law. That's their constitution in essence, isn't it?
Well, it really is. And by the way, the Israelis really don't have a constitution either. Here's what I'll break it down to be it's going to sound simplistic, but I think it's important to understand. When you look about what we have here in the United States and the freedoms we have and between men and women and the races as well, in Sharia law, that isn't there. I mean, you are a second-class citizen if you're a woman. It's that simple. I mean, you are allowed to be caned, meaning they can beat you if you violate the law, if you don't wear the headdress or you're not covered. And I saw the same thing when I was in Saudi Arabia. Until recently, if you were a woman, you could not drive in Saudi Arabia, and they're under Sharia law. Until recently, the academic institutions were separate. There was a women's school and there was a men's school. And even when women would walk with men, it would always be not alongside of them, but actually behind them. So when you look at it, and I brought it down to a really basic level because that's the best way to really understand it. They didn't have a voice. In Saudi Arabia, Mohammed bin Salman, who's the crown prince, has tried to break that. But it's a very, very extreme law. And we don't see that here in the United States. That is not acceptable to us here in the United States. And there's always been a concern about that, about basically Sharia law in certain communities here in the United States. You can't tolerate that. So it's an extreme. And people have to understand that and appreciate it. And the reason I broke that down between men and women, because that is such a stark difference. And it's good to understand that. And then everything falls from there of the importance of religion. And the madrasas, the schools, the religious schools just continue to teach that. And it's a very clear break. It's something I don't think I would want to raise my kids or grandkids under anything that was Sharia law, especially if one of them was a young woman.
Well, and the way they handle crime is different, and there's no freedom of religion either. Is that
well? Yeah,
right?
I think when you talk about handling crime, I want to try to make it as personal as I could between men and women. But I mean, it's everything from either cutting off your head or cutting off your hands. from caning and publicly in public demonstrations. You see that in Iran, you see it in Saudi Arabia, you see it everywhere in the Middle East that's under that kind of law. It's a continuing.
And there's no freedom of religion either, right?
No.
There's no freedom of religion.
Well,
Is there
it's
freedom of
interesting.
religion?
There's not. I mean, you can't go and find a Catholic church in most of those countries. Now, I would tell you, here's what's amazing to me. When I went into Iraq years ago, in Baghdad, I went in and actually saw it. There was actually at one time a Jewish temple and a Catholic church in the same area in Baghdad. Now, since then, the temple has been closed, and the Catholic Church probably has a few members is all, but they actually were, amazingly enough, the Iraqis were relatively tolerant of that. But you can't find that in Saudi Arabia. If you're looking for a temple, and if you're looking for a Catholic church in Saudi Arabia, you're not going to find one. Yet here in Washington, D.C., I can show you one of the largest mosques in the United States is here in Washington, D.C. And so we don't, we tolerate this whole thing on freedom of religion that came from our Constitution, came from our founding fathers. And I think it's something that you don't think about a lot because it's just taken for granted, not taken for granted, probably too strong a word, but we just assume it's going to be there the whole time. And I think the fact is,
And I'm sorry, I didn't mean to interrupt you. So sorry. And we assume that other countries have the same thing we do. We don't really, it's good to understand how the Palestinians and the other, people that are living under Sharia law, what their life is really like. Anyway, okay, thank you. And could speak with you forever, but I have to pass. So I'm going to share the questioning. Thank you so much. Kathy?
Yes, we're going to go to Jewel and Jorn next. Jewel and Jorn?
Hello, General. Thank you for being with us today, and thank you for everything you've done for our nation. I wanted to ask you a little bit about, first, we hear controversy about Israel, and oftentimes detractors will make very outlandish claims all over the place. One thing that I thought was interesting is from a military sense, from a constitutional sense, what do we believe as Americans gives a nation legitimacy? I mean, I know that briefly Israel, England basically constituted Israel, but then they still even had to fight wars after that from the neighboring nations to remain on that land, and ongoing has fought out intruders and attacks through the. So what would delegitimize Israel and yet legitimize another nation?
Well, I think when you talk about legitimacy of a nation, I think, there's a lot that goes into that. And I think the legitimacy of a nation are its people. And do the people tolerate and accept what they've got in where they're living at to do that? And you can put a set of laws, you can put a constitution, you can put whatever there. But I think it's the people, grouping together. And when you talk about legitimacy, it's an interesting concept because, when you talk about the Constitution, which gives us our bedrock, we can rely on it. Where Israel doesn't have a constitution, the Palestinians here don't have a constitution, and their force of arms is basically on the Palestinians is basically you've got an organization like Hamas, which is a terrorist organization, and before that you had Fatah, which is the same. And the Palestinian Authority can't bring them together and work together. We fall back on the Constitution because I think you always, as a people, have to fall back on something. What are you going to fall back on? And the beauty we have here in the United States is we always fall back on the Constitution and the third part of government, which is, it's the lead judicial system, and we've kind of listened to that. We've upheld that. There's always been a lot of controversy, pulls and pushes, and people get frustrated. But the fact is, we constantly rely on this document, and there's the outliers that sometimes don't, but we do. The other nations don't have that luxury, and so what happens? It falls back on what the people want or what the dominant political party wants at the time, and that's the reason why you have these constant turmoil and constant change of governments throughout the world out there, and it's not very clean. I would tell you, to me, being in the national security realm, it's a pretty messy world right now. I'd rather be living here than living anywhere else. And I tell people, I said, that's one of the reasons why people want to come to the United States. They're fleeing what they've got, which they don't like. The openness of government, the rigidity of government. And I don't mean that in a negative way when I say rigidity of government. I mean that the rigidity of government is, it gives you all the things that you've got, the processes, the support systems that you have, from schools to law enforcement to the military cover that you have. It's an interesting question, and I think each nation is different. When you look at the 193 nations that are out there, most of them are different. Even the democratic nations in Europe govern differently than we do, and they have different rules they follow. But our bedrock continues to be the Constitution, and let's just hope we can keep holding it, as Franklin said, as the republic that they established.
Thank you. And do you think that besides any form of hatred of a race of people or bigotry towards a religion, can you find any other reason why we'd single out why we hear so often, and even in college classes, why we hear so often that Israel's not legitimate and some other nations are?
That is a great question, because and I really mean that. That is something that has really, really confused me, because the anti-Semitism that you find on campuses and houses is astounding to me. And let me just break it away a little bit from there. Is when you look at a religious entity like the Jewish faith or the Jewish people, I'm just stunned when you see what has happened to them historically in the past. I tell people, I said, look, if you really want to criticize the Jews and what has happened, then what I want you to do is get on an airplane and you go to Poland and go to a place called Auschwitz. That was the German concentration camp where they killed over 1.5 million Jews in the Holocaust. And I was there, and I sat there and where inside the facility where the railhead ended and where they took the women and children and the men off those trains and marched them right to the gas chambers and then to have them incinerated, the crematoriums out there. And I said, you sit back and you look at it and you go, it's the first time in my life, and I told this to the vice president when I got aboard the airplane that afternoon, I said, it was the first time in my life that I questioned, is there a God? Because God cannot allow this to happen. And he brought me up short and he said, it wasn't God, it was man. So what you're finding is you have people that for some reason have taken a hard stand against Israel, and I don't see why, because they found the homeland. This was given to them basically through the Brits, the turn of the 19th century, and trying to have them live in peace in a pretty bad neighborhood, and there was ways for them to come out of this. And I don't criticize Israel for what they're doing at all. To me, what I saw happen on 7 October and what happened on the aftermath of that was my comment I made to a lot of people about Auschwitz and Dachau and places like that. And I said, the world can't support what I saw, which was abject terrorism, and especially killing of women and children and older people. You can't accept that. And that's the reason why the only way out of this is actually I believe, through economics, not through kinetic action or military action. But it's a great question. It's one of those I think everybody is concerned about it, a little bit confused about. I would tell you.
Part of what's so strange too is that we know that if we look at history a little bit, war's been so different since World War I and World War II, that wars have been different. But when you go back throughout history, there were so many wars and so many lands taken and new nations formed, and through all different means and colonization and different forms of colonization, but also just, genocide of a new people after they were taken over. You can find almost any story from history of how nations came to be, and the nations that protected that sovereignty then are viewed as a nation as any other nation. Basically almost every nation came to be through some form of war. I mean, look back, they had to defend their borders at some point, or they took over that land at some point. So it is confusing to me too, as far when I'm looking at people who seem otherwise intelligent, and we hear an argument that America can't support Israel because Brits gave them the land. I don't know.
Yeah, this is reason I made a comment earlier. I said, when you go back and you think about it, that's the reason I was quite struck when Netanyahu was talking about the actions with Hamas, when he went back to talk about biblical terms. And I said, whoa, he is really going back. And this is an issue that is well before the time of America that they're looking at. And, at one time, when you look at Jerusalem, how many times it changed hands, you look at it and trying to bring everybody together. And frankly, what we looked at in the last administration is we said, look, why don't we look at it this way? We thought, let's make people's lives better, and let's approach it from an economic perspective and build up people. And I think that's an important way to look at it. I think it's a good way to look at it, because if you can make people's lives better, I don't care if it's here in the United States, I don't care if it's anywhere else in the world, people will feel better and they'll start to work together better. But if they don't see a way of a future, then you're going to fall into conflict. And I
That's so
think that's in Israel.
Yeah, that's so powerful. But of course, we thank you for everything you did during that time, because we didn't have, we went in with turmoil, of course, in the Middle East, and we came out of it with significantly less. And unfortunately, we find ourselves with it again. You had mentioned that you think that it's economic policy and not kinetic war that can help stabilize the area. Could you tell us maybe a little bit about that, and constitutionally what you think our role is, and how we should enact any economic policy to help stabilize the region?
Yeah, it doesn't so much it falls really within the power of the President of the United States, because, even though the Congress has the ability to, advise and consent and also create treaties, this is one of those, it's an economic issue for the United States. And the reason I say it's economics is, when we looked at it, is, there's enough ammunition out there, you can kill everybody in the world if you want to, but that's not how you get people working together and you build a better life for everybody. What you try to do on the economic piece is you say, okay, let's see if we can do this, so we can build it out. By the way, we also tried that with North Korea as well. And we said, look, there's a way to do this. Okay, you don't have to continually have ways of threat. It's always good to have in your rear pocket, that ability to use overwhelming force, which the United States has, as long as you have the will to use it. But the economic piece on working in that region is very, very powerful. And the Saudis understand that, and the Emiratis understand, and Bahrain understands that, and this whole region can be fixed. The problem is, you actually have an Islamic State in Iran that doesn't want that to happen. And so they're constantly going to cause problems. So you have to either work around them or basically work through them for it to occur. But it's one of those that you have to, it's almost like you make it in a way. And when I was in the White House, I said, believe it or not, simplicity really means a lot. So make things as simple as you can. And that doesn't mean you dumb it down. What I mean by simple is, have it so it can be executed and people understand it. And as long as you can do that, then you can get people to join with you. Otherwise, people will poke holes in what you're trying to do and where you're going to go, and it's not going to work. Look, I remember when we moved the American embassy we moved it from Tel Aviv to Jerusalem. When we did that, even though it was the Jerusalem Act said we were supposed to do it, and there was like 30 waivers to do it, we were told by our own State Department, you're going to have an intifada. And we said, no, we don't think so. I said, if you always explain it, and you explain it to everybody, it's not going to be a problem. And we did that, and there was nothing. And the American embassy is currently in Jerusalem. It's only one of 3 nations that has an embassy there right now, but it's but that's important. And as long as you can explain it to everybody in a simple way, I think it'll work. And it sounds really, I'm not trying to dumb it down, but I think that's where you have to go with everything.
Thank you so much.
Yeah, thank you, Jewel. Thank you, Jewel, and thank you, Janine. And we're going to go to Kristen.
Great, thank you. Yeah. So I just have a few more questions, but has Israel made a serious offer of peace with the Palestinians? If so, why isn't it working? And is violence in the West Bank, in that whole region, growing because of this war that's going on right now?
Well, I think everybody has given their view of peace, okay? And it's like two ships passing in the night. And how you make this all work is you need to have an interlocutor. You need to have somebody who grabs both sides, sort of like we did years ago when we brought Anwar Sadat in back here to the United States and put him up at Camp David with Menachem Begin and brought them together. And we basically, we fed them, cold pizza and warm beer. We said, after 10 days, come on out with a solution to have it. And that's where they actually came out with the Camp David Accords, which eventually broke down. But it's a way to have this peace to work it together. So what you have to have somebody who's going to bring them together and say, okay, you're going to have some common ground. Right now, I don't see that happening. And here's why it's not going to happen, is because the Palestinians are led, and the Palestinian Authority, which was created actually because of the Oslo Accords years ago, does not have any legitimacy at all. And neither does Hamas. And right now, the Israelis are looking at Hamas and they're saying, look, for years, the people came out of Gaza. They had work permits. They actually became the advanced scouts for what happened on 7 October. So the trust is broken between them. And that trust is going to have to be regained. And that is going to take some time to do it. Because right now you've got the Palestinians who feel as an aggrieved party that the Israelis have land that should be their land. It shouldn't be the Israelis' land. You've had the Israelis now that are very, very opposed to Hamas in the Gaza Strip, and also with Fatah, Palestinian Authority in the West Bank. And it's going to take some time for them to come together. Here's where I come from when it comes to fault. I really fault this time the Palestinian leadership, in the sense not only Abbas, but also Hamas. Remember, Ariel Sharon, 20 years ago, pulled all Israeli settlements under force out of the Gaza Strip. There was 21 of them, pulled them back out, brought them back in Israel to try to calm that area down. And there's never been any real peace between them. And we thought we had that when we created in the last administration the Abraham Accords. And we said to the Palestinians, you come to Bahrain, it was in 2019, and we said, we're going to explain how we think you can come out of this mess. And they wouldn't even show up. And so that's the leadership that you have. Until that leadership changes on the Palestinian side, you're not going to get any break at all from the Israeli side at all. So this fight, this war is going to continue. So the legitimacy is you've got one organization, which is basically a democratic institution that is now going against an institution, Hamas, which is actually a terrorist state. And who's caught in the middle? The Palestinian people are caught in the middle. And it's going to take some time to try to work their way out of it. We have lost our ability to be the interlocutor, because what I mean by that is because we're not trusted by maybe both sides right now, because they don't know really where we're at. Instead of saying, okay, I'm the person that's going to bring you back here to Camp David, like we've done before, let's work it out. I don't see either side wanting to do that right now. So you're going to have to see a slowdown of the fighting. The problem you've got, the real problem you've got out there is you've got another state actor, Iranians, who want to foment trouble in the region. They look at this as good. They don't look at it as bad. They're arming Hamas. They're arming Hezbollah out of the north, which is amazing because Hezbollah has been kind of relatively quiet, all things considered, out there in the southern part of Lebanon. So I don't see this thing ending well for anybody in the near term. But when being into Israel that I have before, when you look at what they've tried to do with that nation state, there's ways they could have worked around this, both sides. But I think right now, there are loggerheads, and I don't see any peace coming to that part of the region in the near term until you eliminate the people that are causing the biggest problem, which are the Iranians. They're just fomenting distrust and problems. Everything that you saw that the Hamas used, that is not homemade stuff for the most part in Gaza, except for the rockets. But a lot of the stuff was brought in from foreign sources. The same thing with Hezbollah to the north. It's not a good situation, and we're not helping it out by basically keeping our hands off as well. And what I mean by hands off, not overt pressure, but basically saying, okay, let's try to work this together. Let's figure a way out of this thing. on both sides. And right now we can't get both sides to even talk.
Thank you. Yeah. So you talked about the American support of Israel, and that's a considerable amount of money. Um, Based on our Constitution and our approach to foreign aid, should American taxpayers be the ones to support Israel through taxation, or should this be a voluntary effort? What would you say to that?
Well, if you walk down that part, it's going to be a really hard one because we give them $3 billion a year. We give by the way, we give the Egyptians the same amount of money. And we give a lot of nations a lot more money than that as well. When you look at voluntary contributions, I think, I will tell you, we use a lot of the American people's money for frivolous things. Okay. And I think asking that is a hard question, is a good question. I think you have to determine what is best and where do we use the taxpayers' money to basically help out. I think that amount of money that we give, which is 3 billion and 3 billion, compared to when you look at, remember, we've given, when you think about it, well over $100 billion to Ukraine fighting Russia right now. It's a good question: has your money been well spent? And I think in that part of the world it has been, because we basically kept, for the most part, the Egyptians and the Saudis and the Israelis not at each other's throat. The Palestinians are a separate story, but I think that money is well spent. But I look at some. I think it's a good question to ask. Are we spending our money wisely elsewhere? I will tell you, when I used to. I'll tell you, it's a personal story. But when I used to go, when a foreign leader would come into the White House, I would always sit in the cabinet level when they met the President of the United States. And the first comment out of his mouth was always, "What is our trade deficit?" I said, "Oh, that always catches them short." It's a great question to ask because it is the people's money. But when it comes to Israel and when it comes to that region, I think that money has been well spent out there. Now, I will question the amount of money we're giving the Palestinians, because we give them around 220 million a year. We took that money away from them. This administration has given it back, and one of the reasons we took it away from them, there's a program with the Palestinians have. We call it the Pay for Slayer program, where they basically give money to people who kill Palestinians who kill Israeli citizens, and it's sort of like a reward. And we said, until that stops, we're not going to give you any money. They give it back to them, which is unfortunate. But again, it's a great question to ask. I think it's a bigger question to ask is our money being spent wisely all around the world? That's a fair question.
Great. Yeah, that was actually going to lead into my other question, which was how much humanitarian aid has actually been sent to Gaza by the US, by Israel, and other agencies? And is it making a difference there?
So how much what has been spent in Gaza?
How much aid has been sent to Gaza?
Well, it's it's a wonderful question, because what's happened is the aid has been sent there, but it's been used by Hamas to build tunnels and to build military systems. If they had used that money to build up Gaza economically, to be like a beautiful beach community, you would have seen a different kind of view coming out of what's happening there in the Gaza Strip. That's part of the frustration everybody has. Where's the money been spent? What's it going to? It's a question that we raised with the Palestinians as well. What are you spending this money on? We actually asked the boss that, to leads the Palestinian Authority. What are you using that money for out there? And the question was, it used wisely? The answer is no, it wasn't, especially in Gaza, because what they actually used it for was to build up the kinetic capability to basically go against Israel and the Israeli state.
That makes sense. Thank you. Yeah, I think that's all the time I have for questions, but thank you so much for your answers.
Thanks.
Yes, thank you. Great questions for our panel, and thank you so much, General Kellogg. We're going to go to some audience questions. But first, we want to recognize our teachers and students that are watching with us today. We have Hope Mucklow, who has homeschool high school students watching with her. Cherie Stiegel with homeschool students. Professor Alex Tokarov with 30 Northwood University students watching. And we have Cami Wanhouse with a homeschool student watching. And if you are a teacher or a classroom that is watching and we didn't give you a shout out, please let us know in the Q&A and we'll do our best to get to you before the end of the program. We also want to thank our listeners on Las Vegas's KKVV 1060 AM. This program airs Monday nights at 6 p.m. Pacific on Las Vegas's KKVV. So thank you so much to all who listen in Las Vegas. So we're going to start, General Kellogg, with a question from Robert McKeeman, who says, would you talk about the attacks on the ships in the Red Sea?
Sure. Well, what you're seeing right now is the attacks on the ships in the Red Sea are basically conducted by a group called the Houthis, a group that we don't really recognize, because the government of Yemen is actually is located elsewhere now. There's actually in Saudi Arabia. And the Houthis are violating international law. In fact, the UN Security Council passed we call an UNSCR, a UN Security Council resolution just a week ago, 11-0, which interestingly enough, the Russians and both the Chinese abstained from voting at all, basically calling out the Houthis for doing this. And they're impeding freedom of navigation from everybody going through the Red Sea, international waters. And they're supported by Iran. That's because if you go to your local, the Houthis are using systems that you can go down to your local Toys R Us and buy. So it's in violation of international law. And what we're seeing is there have been a lot of shipping companies, Mediterranean Shipping, which is the largest in the world. You got Hapag-Lloyd, which is number 5 in the world. You got Maersk, which is number 2 in the world. They're all saying we're going to reroute our shipping from the Red Sea through the Suez Canal, and we're going to go, for the most part, around Africa, the Cape of Good Hope. And what that does economically, it kind of says, okay, think about this in your back pocket. It's increasing the shipping time by 2 weeks, but it's also increasing the cost of shipping containers. They're doubling that. So that's doubling it. That money's going to come out of your wallet because they're going to pass that increased cost onto the consumer as well. And they're doing that at the behest of the Iranians. The Iranians are the state sponsor that's causing the problems there. We have put together a program with the United States called Prosperity Guardian, which is designed to basically escort those ships through the Red Sea, make sure that they're not being attacked. But the Houthis don't care. They're going to continue to do it, despite the attacks that we've had on the Houthi infrastructure just recently. It's not going to change. The only way this is going to change is you're going to have to change their behavior, their leadership behavior, and that's going to be a case of will by the commander-in-chief. That's Article 2, Section 2, and when you go back, and he's got the ability to do that, and he's going to have to alert Congress. Where you go back and what you see, Congress's role in declaring war in Article 1, Section 8, and then you go back to the War Powers Act of 1973. Basically, within 48 hours, they got to notify Congress, and then within 60 days, if they don't have some type of declaration of war, they pull it out. But these are defensive measures we are looking at. Well, we're going to have to take some type of measure, and I think they're going to up the game to do that, to change the whole dynamic. And that means it's presidential will. That's where when I was in the White House, that was the big issue we had at the national security level, was because the role of the president. And the role of the president is quite strong as a chief executive, in his role under Article 2, Section 2, as commander-in-chief, and what he can do. And right now, there's a lot of options that this president going to have. And one of the options that you always have, regardless of what you do in life, in business, or in the government, is doing nothing as an option. We made the decision not to take, as a nation, not to do anything hard. And what does that mean? Is these attacks are going to continue. But again, it's a clear violation of international law, freedom of navigation. And right now, my concern is something's going to break hard, meaning something's going to go bad, and then you're going to see an escalation. It's better to treat escalation early by super escalating than it is to wait and then have to react to something later on. And what I mean by that is this president, any president, is going to have to take hard actions if he wants this to stop. Because if it doesn't, this is going to continue tomorrow, next week, next month, all through the year.
Well, thank you. That was a great explanation and analysis. Robert Zimmerman says the conditions in Gaza prior to the invasion to me don't seem like a prison or concentration camp, as many have stated in prior reports. Your thoughts?
Yeah, when you look at Gaza, Gaza was actually, when Ariel Sharon took out the settlements of the Israelis there, and again there was 21 of them. He basically walled off Gaza. He basically said, okay, over there, but there was an economic transfer where people could come work inside Israel. But what happened is the hardcore took over. Fatah was originally in charge of Gaza, and then what happened was Hamas beat Fatah politically, and then they forced the Palestinian Authority, Abbas, to relocate to the West Bank. When you look at it, it's a self-inflicted wound. And what they did is they used the money that they've got to build up basically, and in my term, a terrorist organization in Hamas, and they did that at the expense of citizens. Because when you look at that area, it's actually, when you look at it 3 decades or 4 decades ago, it's a beach area. Just think about that, because it's right on the Mediterranean, the whole Gaza area. And it's a beautiful area, but economically, they're in a distressed state because of what's happening with the leadership that's happening there inside Gaza itself. So it's a walled city. It's going to make harder for those people to get to work inside Israel, because Israel's not going to let them work there anymore because they don't trust them anymore. So that's the problem they've got. It was just it's a lot of people living in a very, very small area, and they haven't looked out for the people. They've gone into the government that runs Gaza, and you think it's 2 different groups. Remember, when you look at the Palestinians, you've got Gaza, which are run by Hamas, and you've got the West Bank, which is run by Fatah. And the Palestinian Authority under Abbas hasn't done anything for any of them. So it's an area that is in distress right now, more so today than it was a few weeks ago. But it's of their own making. It's hard to say it, but it's true.
Well, thank you. And David Rich asks, General, there are many who see the U.S.-Israel relationship as a one-way engagement, with the U.S. helping Israel without anything in return. Can you help provide insight into the areas that Israel supports the United States, like U.S. military reliance on intelligence services, software and computer hardware for both defensive and offensive weapons, and Middle East diplomacy? And what would happen to the United States without such support from Israel?
Yeah, it's a great question, because when you look at it, I'll give you one example militarily. They put together, what you talk about, missile defense, probably the premier missile defense system, what they call Iron Dome, in the world. And that was, by the way, that's a joint U.S. and Israeli venture out there. And that is something that could be extended not only here to the United States, but elsewhere in the world. So militarily, they've done that exceptionally well. When you look at them being our rock as a democratic nation in the Middle East that has its elected body as a governance body, that's kind of our reliance as a friend in the region. So when you say, what are they? Well, it's nice to have a friend in the region that gives you, if necessary, an anchor to pivot from anywhere there in the world. And there's a way for them to work. They're under stress. They're under threat. And it's something that we've said we will protect them in the sense that there's no treaty with them, but it's an ability for us to work with the Israelis and the Israeli government. But, when you look at what they have done for us, they've always been a strong supporter of the United States. They've been there when we've needed them. And remember, when you look at the sheer density, not only of population, but of government, it's a pretty small country, and you can't really expect them to do a whole lot supporting us. They do come up with some great stuff militarily that we've used, and we use right now their Iron Dome stuff. We're sending out to Ukraine and other places throughout the world. So it's not a pure, like it is not a pure economic transfer like we have between us and the French, or us and the Brits, or us and the Germans, but it's still there.
Well, thank you. And Robert Summers asks, when planning a military operation, Does a general have to factor in constitutional issues?
Why, it's almost, it's assumed. I mean, you don't say, okay, the Constitution this is what we're doing, but you have to think about it when you do something like that. And by the way, the generals don't do it. That is why you have civilian control of the military, because it emanates from the commander in chief, the president of the United States. And anything that comes out of the military goes through the second layer of civilian control, was the Secretary of Defense. By the way, that's one of the big issues today they've had when Secretary of Defense Lloyd Austin kind of went, missing for a while because he had these health issues out there. Well, what that would cause a break in the civilian control of the military. You have to understand that the military doesn't act on its own. They act through civilian orders that are given to them from the elected officials. So when you say, do they think about it? Part of that is you assume that the civilian control, they've already thought about those constitutional issues, and that the acts that they're taking are in fact constitutionally mandated. The biggest issue that you find today, there's a lot of talk about it, is the Insurrection Act of 1807, which was actually used well over 20 times by presidents of the United States. The most recent one was in the LA riots, when George H.W. Bush used the military to be brought into LA to try to control the riots, which allows him to do that in case of some type of turmoil. But we in the military, we'd react to the civilian orders because we assumed the actions they were taking were constitutionally mandated. So the military doesn't do that. The military never sits back, and you don't want it to. You don't want to have what they used to call a soldier on horseback deciding what is good and what is bad. You do not want the military involved in any type of political discussions, political activities. So when I was given an order, I'd say yes, sir, and I'm assuming that civilian control of the military was there, and they were making those decisions, and they're the ones responsible for determining the political correctness of it.
Well, thank you. And we've got about 2 minutes left, but we'll work in one more question. Sandy Thatcher asks, the Biden administration is inching towards a more proactive role in the current military conflict. At what point does the constitutional requirement that Congress declare war take over from presidential executive orders? In Vietnam, it took the Gulf of Tonkin incident to prompt Congress to get involved.
Yeah, how that involves now is because of what happened actually in Vietnam, and the Cambodian invasion was the War Powers Act of 1973, where that's where we said that the Congress has said, if you can take offensive action, as long as you notify us within 48 hours of the action taking place. But within 60 days, you've got to come to Congress for a declaration of war, for an extension of the activities that you're doing. They'll extend it automatically for 30 days, and then they make that determination, do we need to have a declaration of war? It's interesting enough because that thing has never been adjudicated by the Supreme Court. It just kind of said, okay, it's out there, work with it. Nixon vetoed it when it was first passed by Congress. Congress overrode the veto. Or it kind of sits out there on the side. You're aware of it. When you're in the military, you're planning for it. That's one of those concerns you've always got. But to kind of work your way through it, anytime there's a military activity, Congress is always brought in. It's called the Gang of Eight. You bring them in, and when I was inside the White House, you'd bring them in, you'd sit them down at the cabinet room, you said, okay, this is what we intend to do. This is the military operation we're going to take before the action occurred. And we'd say, this is what we're going to do. This is what we plan to do. And to make sure that Congress was in fact notified. I think that happens all of the time. It's kind of like an invisible link between the War Powers Act, the Constitution, and your elected officials. But I don't recall one time when there was a military action taken in the previous administration, either going after Soleimani or going after ISIS or Baghdadi, that Congress was not involved. Congress was not informed. Not the whole body, but the leaders of both parties, the Intelligence Committee, the leaders of the Armed Services Committee were always brought in and briefed. So that's your protection, not necessarily of the Constitution, because it's very, very clear in Article 1, Section 8, who declares war? That's the Congress of the United States. That's the duality of that and the commander-in-chief role. But there are safeguards in place. I believe that cover us very, very well.
Well, thank you. And we're right at the top of the hour, but I know Janine has a closing remark. So Janine, we're going to go back to you.
Well, General Kellogg, I just want to thank you for your service to our country. What a hero you are. And it was just a real treat and an educational experience to have you on our show today. And I thank you so, so much. And, I think what resonates with me the most about what you said is that we shouldn't look at the history of Israel necessarily with the early 1900s or World War II. We really need to go further back and explore the history of Israel, before Christ. I mean, back in Solomon's day and David's day, and there's a long, rich history there that needs to be explored and just shouldn't resonate around World War II, World War One.
Yeah, I would
Would you agree with that?
that I would actually go back to biblical times to really understand the depth of this issue that's happening in the Middle East, because they do, both sides. And it's interesting to watch that. It's something you can't bring. I think you make a mistake if you just think in current terms. You got to see where they're coming back, people, and what happened to them in World War II. And remember, at the end of 1945, we said to the world, never again. And the Israelis are never again going to be put in that position. They're going to fight for their survival to the extreme level that needs to be fought.
Well, thank you.
Yeah, it all goes back to it all goes back to Abraham. It goes back to Abraham.
Yep.
Way back in the Bible. All right. Thank you so much, General Kellogg, and all the wonderful guests and panel. Appreciate you all. Thank you, Kathy.
Thank you. Thank you, everyone. And we hope to see you next week, Tuesday at 2 Eastern. Thank you to the audience. We'll see you next week.